The TOGAF ADM diagram shows the 10 phases of ADM with 8 phases organized around the requirement phase in the middle that forms the central core. I like to think of this arrangement as a rotating gear, or sometimes I do think of them as a reverse induction motor that spins the architecture development activities through phases in the outer circle as architecture requirements, which I imagine as the equivalent of electricity flowing into the system through the architecture requirement phase in the middle. The preliminary phase at the top can be thought of as an intelligent switch that initiates and configures a given iteration. I know it is a very crude and improvised analogy with many potential flaws, but I hope the visualization makes it easier to remember how the ADM iteration operates. It is also worth noting that although TOGAF allows ADM to be tailored and customized as you see fit, it does define some standardized iterations out of the box based on what seems to be followed by majority of the practitioners in the industry. These standard iterations include the architecture capability iteration, architecture development iteration, transition planning iteration, and architecture governance iteration. Let's look at each of these and in the process also take a quick lap around the ADM phases. So first, the architecture capability iteration. This iteration typically spans the preliminary and vision phase of ADM. In this iteration, the need and scope for architecture work is established and validated. The vision for the desired target state is articulated. The principles and governance frameworks are established. The team is formed, responsibilities, accountabilities, handoff points, and interfaces into other enterprise processes are identified, and the architecture development effort is initiated. Let's look at each of the phases in this iteration individually. First, the preliminary phase. The preliminary phase is meant to analyze and initiate the architecture development process. It is a phase where the architecture team contemplates and arrives at a consensus on the why and the how of architecture work in the context of a given iteration. This phase essentially has 4 objectives. First, to establish the context of the proposed ADM iteration. That is, it attempts to clearly define the drivers for the architecture work. And next, it establishes the scope of the architecture and thereby also identify the parts of the enterprise impacted by this work. It then identifies if TOGAF framework needs to be further tailored or optimized to fit into the current context of the enterprise. Here is where you would decide how you would need to tailor the ADM to suit your needs and decide which phases of ADM you would want to execute as part of that iteration and in what order. And also if the architecture team will interface with any other enterprise frameworks. For example, say a program or portfolio management framework such as the Prince2, Scrum, or SAFe, or an IT service management framework such as ITIL. And where customization is needed, this phase actually articulates how the customization occurs. It also at a high level articulates the rough sketch preliminary view of the target state capabilities of the enterprise that is aimed for by the ADM cycle. In addition to these, this phase also typically identifies a set of candidate architecture principles that will guide the architecture work in that iteration and other iterations spawned from it. It will also establish the architecture team that would work on different parts of the puzzle and also decide on a rough governance framework that would ensure the fidelity of architecture and business vision as architecture gets further elaborated and taken to implementation. TOGAF recommends documenting the findings and understanding arrived at this phase in a document called Request for Architecture Work, which is distributed across the architecture team, the program sponsors, and key stakeholders in order to build consensus and to obtain any feedback or objections. Phase A, or the vision phase of TOGAF, is technically the first phase of the ADM cycle. It is initiated based on the consensus arrived at between the architecture team, the program sponsors, and other key stakeholders around the findings of the preliminary phase. where the analysis done in the preliminary phase and documented in a formalized deliverable determines that there is merit and value in proceeding with the rest of the phases of ADM. The objective of this phase really is to, number one, define the overarching vision, which defines the aspirational end state capabilities aimed by the current iteration of ADM, and perhaps for any iterations that might be spawned from the current one. It also further validates the business context, drivers, scope, stakeholder concerns, the business value of the proposed target state capabilities, etc. This phase culminates in the creation of a formal statement of architecture work, which articulates the outcome of the analysis done in this phase, which then is agreed and endorsed by relevant stakeholders to move the architecture development forward.